Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Jojo. I appreciate that. Yes, yeah, yeah. If y'all can't tell by now, just because I'm the teacher does not mean that I know everything. All right, that's gonna be if college is could be considered metaphorically to be an introduction or rather a step beyond the curtain. One thing that you all will discover is that your professors do not know everything. But actually, really, the best way for teaching and learning to occur is when both of us can actually share our dialogues or share our knowledge with each other. And for anybody, just as an FYI, a fun aside, for anyone who actually read my personal history statement, you'll see that's actually one of the core fundamental principles of my teaching philosophy, right? For teachers and instructors, and also too for for teachers and students, as well as students and students, right, to share their knowledge and insights with each other through dialogue, right, and a kind of careful exchange, what we would call like a Socratic exchange, which is one of the fundamental principles of teaching and learning that date all the way back to about 3,000 years ago during the ancient Greek and Roman teachings, more so the ancient Greek teachings coming out of Socrates. It's partially one of the reasons why he was actually killed, or rather assassinated by hemlock poisoning, because he was poisoning the youth. um, Speaking of which, so yes, I thank you so much, Jojo. I definitely am going to be looking forward to that. Um, Speaking of rhetoric 3,000 years ago, or rather Socrates 3,000 years ago, and rhetoric, that's part of what I want to actually share with you all and drop some knowledge, some insight on today. Is I want to introduce you all to this concept called rhetoric. And even before we actually talk about nickel and dimed, I feel like I need to actually introduce this concept of rhetoric because this will inform in a major way um, all of our approach to engaging with Barbara Ehrenreich's text. Okay. It's fun to read. Um, it can be. Let me change that up, right? It can be fun to read. All right. Um, I did not actually enjoy reading prose texts, right? So just prose is just text without pictures. Um, I actually did not enjoy that until graduate school, or rather later on in hello, what's going on? Alkaline, Alkaline, what's happening? Welcome to your friendly neighborhood Professor Cag's YouTube live. You are in the YouTube room, the YouTube studio. I'm still trying to figure out what to call this place. You're in the class with Cag. All right. I think I'm just gonna have to stick with that for right now. Welcome to In the Class with Cag. Glad that you could join us. I did not actually enjoy reading prose text until I was like late in my undergrad, like well into my major, as an undergraduate student. And then certainly, I think I started to like kind of develop a rhythm with reading. Part of the reason why I did not enjoy it so much was because I honestly did not. What's going on, Diana? What's happening? Welcome, welcome, welcome to In the Class with Cag. Glad you could join us. I did not actually start enjoying reading until that time because I didn't know how to read, right? I'd never really had someone sit down with me and clue me in on this is how you read a text in college. Okay. If you can think back with me to about 3 weeks ago, so week one, um, there was a discussion board that I had you all complete, which was um, where you either recorded a video or you just typed out your answers. Many of you actually chose to type out your answers across all of my classes about what your reading history was like, right? The reason why I asked that question for discussion board number one was really because I want to see where you are and I want to see what your relationship with reading is like, right? Oftentimes, when you're oftentimes in college, you're always going to have reading, right? All of your professors are going to assign a bunch of reading to you, right? And they do expect, similar to me, right? I expect you all to get it all done. Um, and yes, it is possible to get it all done. Um, but you might be struggling with from the same kind of ailment that I was struggling with, right? So it may not seem possible or even feasible to get all of that reading done, right? You might be thinking, as I was when I was in undergrad, man, what are these professors smoking? Like, because I can't get all this reading done. That's not happening. Until I learned how to move through a text, right? Until I learned how to move until I learned what to read for, right? Joe, I got a witness right here in JoJo. Right. So I'm just keeping it a buck with y'all. Okay. It was not that long ago that I was actually in college. And I don't mean as an undergrad. I mean, I just recently, a few years ago, was back, put myself back into the saddle, back in the seat of being a student. And I completed my doctoral degree at UCLA. And I had to sit down. I had to, while I was teaching, right? I was working full time at Cerritos College. And, I had to read, I had to write, I had to, do exams. I had to do all the things that y'all are doing, in a different, albeit a different context, right? At the doctoral level. But I had to do my reading and I had to do theirs, right? So, the thing I think that actually helped me by the time I got into the doctoral program is the fact that I knew how to move through texts. I knew how to move through um I knew what to read for, right? And so that's what I want to actually share with y'all today is um a strategy which has within it a series of techniques, right? Um, the relationship between strategies and techniques, they're not the same, right? They are different, they are distinct and unique. It helps if we understand what the relationship is, right? It helps us to better understand what the distinction is between the two if we understand the relationship between the two, talking about strategies and techniques, right? Strategy is like the vehicle, right? The car itself, right? Techniques are like your passengers that exist within the car, right? So you got different type of passengers who actually roll with you, right? But you got one vehicle. Okay, so you can have multiple techniques within this one vehicle, right? Likewise, you can have multiple techniques that exist within the larger strategy or framework, right, that you're going to employ. In this case, for critical thinking and reading, right? So that's what I want to share with y'all today. Um, just because I think that'll be helpful. And it's also what makes the reading engaging, right? Um, I like I said, I'm just gonna kind of dive back into that story and then pull up some notes for y'all so that way we can kind of get into a little bit of we can get into some teaching here. Like I said, I won't be teaching for very long. But um I had absolutely no clue as an undergraduate student what to read for, right? And so it was very boring. Reading prose text to me was boring. One of the biggest tricks in the world that teachers, really just that the education system actually pulled on me. I felt this as a child. One of the biggest tricks that they had ever pulled on me was like snatching pictures away from words, right? Or out of books. I felt like betrayed. Like, wow, I was really starting to get the hang. This was like way back in first grade or second grade, right? So I'm like 6, 7 years old, right? 5, 6, 7 years old, somewhere around there. I was really starting to get the hang of reading and like, putting the pictures with the words. And I'm like, oh, yeah, heck yeah. Like, I love this, right? This is super fun. It's engaging. It's reading, right? By the time I got to like kind of second grade, all the pictures disappeared. And I'm like, who pulled the wool out from under me, right? Like, where's the gag? Where's the joke? Bring the pictures back. I'm not digging this new kind of reading, right? So it would take me forever to read through prose texts, right? And that ended up actually being a major problem that stuck with me for the duration of my educational journey. I did poorly on just about all standardized tests, right? The standardized test that they would give you. I went to school back in the 1900s, so yeah. I think y'all probably take different tests now, but they used to have these like kind of state standardized tests and things like that. And I mean, it was probably way closer to the dinosaur age for a lot of my younger folks who were kind of in the chat, just joining me fresh out of high school. Is way closer to the dinosaurs than probably than y'all's experience um, when you were going through elementary. But you know, when they gave me tests, it took me forever to read through all of those little passages that they had, right? And I would end up just running out of time. So if you look at all my state standards tests, right, they're like, below average in reading comprehension, below average in, this, that, the third, right, math, so on and so forth. Right. Science, I was actually like above average for some odd reason. And vocabulary, I was also above average, right? So, just to kind of put a side note in that or put a pin in that, once I got the thing that actually kind of helped me to sustain like my above average vocabulary and things like that was that I love to read comic books, right? Comics were like the best literacy tool that my parents and grandparents had ever like supported me in developing. My parents also, specifically my dad and my grandmother, more so than anybody else, they made sure that I was always at a bookstore and that I was always grabbing books and that I was always reading. They were, they weren't willing to, they weren't as willing to buy like Jordans or like tennis shoes, like the newest, coolest pair of tennis shoes and things like that. I also didn't like really, I wasn't really into tennis shoes and things like that, right? Like no shade to anybody who's like a sneakerhead, like even from like way back, like when you were kids. Like my friends were certainly sneakerheads, and it was like, oh snap, yo, dang, yeah, that's cool. But eh, Jordans back then were like $100. So I'm cool. I can get like a lot of comic books for $100. That's a Christmas gift for me. So comics help to facilitate my practice and skills with reading. Um, when I got to undergrad, and I think I mentioned this last week, when I first became an English major, I had absolutely no clue what was going on in those classes. I didn't understand what they were talking about. They were making a ton of different references that were way over my head, right? So I really had no idea what the heck was going on in a lot of those classes because for me, they were speaking a language that kind of sounded like English, but not really. It sounded more like, I don't know, like they were using words that looked familiar that I'd heard before, but that had a completely different meaning. So for myself, I took it upon myself to actually go to my professor's office hours and just stayed on in there, made friends with my TA, right? And then I used to ask them, like, sometimes I would sit in office hours, similar to like what this is right now. I would just sit and kick it with them, like in the office, right? Like, literally, I'm just an undergrad student. I'm not even in their classes anymore. This is after I passed out of their classes. I would still go back to those same TAs, sit down, chop it up with them, talk about the latest current events, or talk about, anything, a movie, music, whatever, right? And then I would ask them questions about like, yo, how do you get all that reading done, right? Well, a lot of them, they were all fast readers. I'm like, well, damn, that doesn't help me, all right? But there was this one time that I spoke with. It was actually my at UC Riverside, we had a class called English 1B, and it was argumentative writing. He was my former TA or my former instructor for that class. His name was Nick Valdez. Man, one of the best instructors that I had ever had. I think he started teaching at UC Merced some time ago, possibly on a tenure track position, meaning that he was like full time permanent. But man, he was like my inspiration. He was like the closest thing to me, who like closest person to me who showed me, yo, you can do this thing. He mentioned this other professor whose class he was taking, and his name was Voris Nunley, and he was like a genius, right? and he taught or knew this discipline called rhetoric. And I'm like, what is that? I've never heard of that. I don't, is that like English? Like, this is a real question. Is that English? I really asked him that. And he was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a discipline that they teach in English, right? And so he was struggling to kind of explain what it was because I think it was his first time getting introduced to it. But oh shoot, I think I forgot. I can't. Oh dang it. This thing won't even let me share things outside of the YouTube or like the Google Chrome. Oh heck, let's see if it does. We gotta try it. Let's try it. Why not? Okay, give me a thumbs up if y'all can see something like other than my face in my background. I don't think so because I can't see it. Select the tab to share entire screen. Nope. Okay, thank you. All right, let's see if we could do. Let's do that. Let's see if we can share my entire screen. Nope, nada, huh? Okay. All right. All right. All right. Huh. That sucked. This was supposed to be way smoother as a setup. I promise y'all. I know what I'm doing. Just not online. Okay, let me see if I can actually pull something up from over here. Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna actually take y'all through one of the classes. We'll go over the modules since YouTube will only let me share a tab on Google. Where are we? Course schedule. Let's do course modules. There we go. Okay, there we go. Boom, boom. Okay, now y'all should be able to. Yes, okay, great. I think y'all can see it now. Perfect. Okay, where are we? Okay, we are in week 3. Let's minimize this. Y'all, hey, FYI. Okay, so I don't know about you all. Let me go to view as a student. I don't know about you all, but when I was in as a doctoral student, we had all online classes. I ended up going to get my doctorate during the time of COVID. So everything was online. Nobody was meeting in person. And let me tell you, it was kind of difficult for me to like, it was overwhelming for me to try to navigate through the modules. We use Canvas as well. It was overwhelming for me to try to like navigate my way through the modules with all these tabs open like this. Like this stuff here is like an eyesore for me. So look, if you find yourself in the same boat like me, like I'm like, what the heck is all this? Let's tune the noise down on all this stuff. Minimize these things, y'all. Stick with the week that we're in, okay, or the tab that you want to focus on, right, under course modules, right? Minimize everything else and just only like expand the tab that you want to focus on, okay? So that's just like a kind of FYI, like a little helpful tidbit here. Um, okay, so let's dive into, let me see. Okay, no, heck, I don't want to do that. All right, I want to introduce rhetoric to y'all, and I'm going to end up making this available anyway tonight. So let me go ahead on and just start here. Okay, so as you can see, right, I have all of your modules like open or like develop all the way through like week 15. Okay, so I don't make them available or publish them, make them visible to y'all until like a few days before the week actually begins. That's because I don't want to overwhelm y'all. Okay, but I'm showing y'all like my vision, right? I'm showing you what our canvas looks like from the professor's lens, right, or from the professor angle, from the professor side. So you're kind of stepping behind the curtain. Okay. So next week, what we're going to actually discuss, we're going to dive deep into this concept of rhetoric and rhetorical analysis. Okay. But I want to introduce this concept to y'all because right now through our YouTube live, because I think that it'll help to introduce a very important idea to y'all, right? And because I can't actually share my screen. So I have like a whole lecture on this, right? Um, I have a whole lecture on this, like on my notes, like on a Microsoft Word document. YouTube won't allow me to actually share that. So I have to kind of jump ahead, right? So don't worry, don't fear. I know that this might actually look brand new. It is because I haven't published it yet, but it will be published this evening, okay? Across all of my classes. So I'm giving y'all a little bit of a sneak peek. This is what y'all get for coming to office hours with CAG, okay? Y'all get a sneak peek behind the curtain before everybody else, right? This is fresh, right? It's fresh out the kitchen. Don't touch it yet. It's hot. All right. So let's start right here, right? Okay. So like 3,000 years ago, right, there were these dudes, and I say dudes very intentionally because they wouldn't allow women like in in these positions, right? In the positions of being um teachers by and large, right? There were a few exceptions, right? Like Aspasia, right? In ancient Greek culture, right? You had a few, very few exceptions, right? So like Socrates was one of those dudes whose name I'm sure y'all have heard of, right? He was like an OG, right? Very old school OG, right? Then you also have Plato, right? Who's a name I'm sure you all have also too heard of, even if only tangentially, right? And then there's also this dude way back in the day called Aristotle, right? Okay, so here's the relationship between these folks and why they're kind of semi-important. Honestly, Aspasia was actually way smarter than all of these folks. There's Aspasia was in it's Aspacia. Very cool person to actually look into, especially from the ancient Greek times, right? Aspasia was the teacher of Socrates. We know Socrates because of Socratic questioning, right? Which is, in other words, that thing that y'all's instructors and teachers throughout, like, um, elementary school, junior high, and high school used to do, right? Where they would just like kind of put pressure on your ideas and on your thinking, right? By asking more questions, right? That's what's called, that's a technique or rather a strategy called Socratic questioning. That dude, Socrates, was one of the most famous philosophers from way back in the day, 3,000 years ago, who introduced this concept of otherwise known as the dialectical, right? So arriving at the truth through conversation, through the back and forth, right? So again, those of you who actually read through some of my personal history statement, if you got through, I think it's about maybe 2.5, maybe 3 pages or so like that, you'll see dialogue, right? And the dialectic, right? The going back and forth, right? The exchange of ideas and knowledge between two individuals, right? In a verbal format, right? Otherwise, what I call in there, right? Drawing out of the traditions, the Socratic traditions of hip hop, right? Hip hop culture, particularly freestyling and battling. Those things there come from not just the freestyling and battling, right? But rather the idea of the dialectic and the dialogue, the going back and forth, the verbal exchange between two individuals, right, to arrive at truth. That concept of arriving at truth through verbal exchange is what is known as a philosophy, right? The search for truth, right? Philosophia, right? Philos meaning love of, right? Um, Sophia meaning truth, right? So philos, right, meaning love of, like in a kind of brotherly way, right, or like a kind of like a kind of platonic way, so not romantic, right? And then Sophia, right, meaning wisdom, right, the lover of truth, the lover of wisdom. It also refers to one who seeks wisdom, right? To call one a philosopher, right, a philosopher, right, is an individual who seeks truth, right, who approaches, who pursues and goes after truth, right? um, and not just like capital T truth, but rather the truth that actually emerges from the careful exchange and the careful sharpening, right? The revision of one's perspective of themselves and the world around them through the exchange of ideas with another, right? That particular approach to philosophia, right, is rooted in Socrates, right? That's what is known as the Socratic method, right? Or the Socratic approach, right? To truth, right? And that dialogue there is his way, his philosophy on how one can learn, right? Socrates taught Plato, right? Actually, in a very real kind of way, Socrates taught a lot of people, but one of his most well-known students was Plato. And in fact, his was interesting. Again, little funny side note: we actually have absolutely no clue what Socrates said in historical, tangible, real life sense. In a historical, tangible, real life sense. Why? Because the only evidence that we have that Socrates was even a real person is derived from the plays that Plato wrote. Plato, who's a student of Socrates, was a playwright, right? Meaning that his approach to truth was actually written in, or excuse me, was that truth could only be approached, never even reached, through the representation of something else, right? The representation of the form of an idea, right? For him, there's this notion of like a platonic ideal, right? Like, or like a platonic friendship, right? Many of you, I'm saying it this way, right? Not not to talk down to y'all. Right? I realize how I'm saying this, right? So I don't mean any disrespect when I'm saying that, but I'm just trying to kind of slow it down because some of you might have actually heard these phrases and these words here before, right? And so Plato's approach to philosophy was rooted in the concept that we can't even reach truth. We can't even perceive, like our minds can't even conceptualize what an actual truth, capital T truth, is, right? But rather that we can only access it through something else, right? Some kind of form of truth, some kind of representation that's made manifest, a part of, right, this truth. Okay. And for him, right, how he approached that, right, is through writing plays in the form of dialogues, right? So here, right, we can actually see again, like this kind of continuous theme between or from Socrates to Plato, that truth is best approached through the exchange, the careful exchange of knowledge and wisdom, right? Dialogue, right? Between two individuals, right? Or between multiple individuals. Okay. Aristotle is a student of Plato. Aristotle is the scientist of the entire bunch of those three, right? And he is most remembered for creating a taxonomy, or rather, the rules, right, of philosophy, right? The rules specifically of the philosophy of how one arrives at truth and how one persuades another, right? The approach or the philosophy of how individuals or an individual can persuade another, right? The philosophy of persuasion is largely associated and attributed to Aristotle. Now, mind you, Aristotle did not invent this. I must say this, right? He's like Drake, okay? There's a rapper from Canada, right? He used to play on a television show back in like the early 2000s. It was called Degrassi, right? And there was a character on there. Who went by Jimmy Cooks, right? AKA also too known as like Wheelchair Jimmy, right? For anybody who may have grown up on that, right? Or may have seen that show, right? Degrassi. Drake is now a very famous, popular rapper from Canada, and he did not invent anything at all. He, in fact, did not invent anything that is unique in terms of his rap style or approach, but rather what we know Drake to be famous for is for making other people's approaches famous when it comes to rapping, right? When it comes to song making, right? Um, so for any of my hip hop heads out there, or anybody who might have actually been interested, or might have even kind of been like a passing spectator or viewer on the Kendrick Lamar and Drake beef from last year, right? That's what that whole beef there was actually about, right? Or rather, one of the main causes that lied at the heart of that beef. Drake, similar to Aristotle, right, made what other people had said about, or what other people say, popular, right? That's what the relationship is between Drake and Aristotle. They weren't the first ones to do it. They weren't the inventors, however, they were the folks who were the most popular, who had the loudest voice, right? Drake who? Exactly. Wheelchair Jimmy. Right. So he made, right, him and Aristotle, right, made what other people were saying popular, right? For Aristotle, he went around, right, and studied from all these different people, right, the science or the philosophy of persuasion, right? He made that thing there popular, right? He gathered up, right, all the insight, all the knowledge, all the notes that he took from all his teachers, right, and he collected it into a single book. And that book is what is widely known now and practiced when people teach the philosophy of persuasion. It's what is called Aristotle's On Rhetoric. Okay, right? That book right there will teach you the science of persuasion, or in other words, right, the philosophy of persuasion that Aristotle collected from all of his learning journey, right? So once he collected these, and these were all like in the form of scrolls and things like that, right? So once he collected all these lectures, right, in scrolls, these ideas, these lessons, he put them all into a particular form, and then he would actually teach at his school called the Lyceum. Okay, right. So way back in the day, Aristotle was one of the most famous teachers of persuasion, the art of persuasion, right? Now, how does this actually relate to what we're here to talk about today? Well, what many of you all are going to learn about next week. Let me actually go back one. You all are going to learn about rhetoric, right? And rhetoric refers to, here, I want y'all to write this down. Rhetoric refers to, I'm going to give you the definition from, I've modified it so that way it's kind of, it's more easily understandable, it's more easily digestible, from Aristotle's book on rhetoric, right? So here's the modification, the modified version. The definition of rhetoric, right? Rhetoric refers to a way of observing how in any given speech or writing situation an audience is persuaded. All right. Look at your virtual neighbor in the chat and say, what did he say? What was that? Repeat that one more time for me, Kay. I'm gonna drop the definition in the chat, right? Rhetoric refers to a way of observing how in any given speech, vocal, or writing situation, an audience or whoever it is who's receiving the message is persuaded. Okay. All right. Now, I mean, like, technically, because so when I went to Penn State, this was the discipline that I actually studied, right? And that I was steeped in. This is what my degree is actually in. Okay. It's in rhetoric and composition. So the formal definition that was seared into those of us who went out to Penn State to study rhetoric and composition, the formal definition that was seared into our brains, right, comes directly from Aristotle. So I'm just going to verbalize it for you, right? But here's the definition that's operational. Okay, right? It's in the chat. This is the not modified version. Okay, the definition from Aristotle is the faculty of observing in any given situation the available means of persuasion, right? The faculty of observing, right? Means it refers to one's capacity, right? How can you read or understand or decipher what your audience finds to be the most persuasive? And how can you use that knowledge in your own messaging to persuade your audience, to connect with them, right? In such a way that they'll actually be the people who are like kind of neutral, right, on whatever your message is, or the people who are who like kind of disagree with you, right? How could you speak to them in such a way that you could actually get them to change their hearts or their minds about you? That's what the definition, the philosophy, and the science of rhetoric is all about. And I use those three, right? I mean those three things in as kind of overlapping and the same, right? I mean them in like in the ancient ways that those concepts there are actually established, right? So, right, the art, right, the science, and the philosophy, right? Those three concepts right there, the art, the science, and the philosophy, all meant the same thing in ancient Greek times, right? So you'll see, right, a techne, right, is the word for science for art, right? Techne, as in technology. We would most clearly associate technology right now with science, right? However, in ancient Greek times, techne referred to one's art. Okay, right? So I'll use those three interchangeably. I just want to kind of give you all that. So just kind of tie it back on in, right? Rhetoric refers to a way of observing in any given speech or writing situation how an audience is persuaded. And the thing that I want for y'all to actually understand and to learn more about, right, is going to be covered most clearly here in Writing Arguments, chapter 8, right? So when you all get this a little bit later on this evening, right, you guys can dive on into this chapter right here and you'll learn all about rhetorical analysis, okay? Right? But I can kind of scroll back up here, right? This week's chapter in reading, right? I want to start you all off with baby steps into this concept of rhetoric, right? With the rhetorical précis. Précis is just quite simply a French word for summary. Okay. So, excuse me one quick second. I just realized it's almost 7 o'clock on the dot, and I'm not at a bus stop. And it's super duper dark in here, and I look like I am telling ghost stories. So please just excuse me for like one quick second. I am going to dang, I can't pause my screen, huh? All right, hold on one quick second. Let me go turn on some light right here so that way I don't look like Count Dracula, the professor version. Okay. Jeez Louise. Yikes. What a difference some light makes. Okay. So I have to be mindful of that the next time that we do this live next week. Keep my lights on, even though it's light outside. Okay. So I want to introduce you all to this concept, right? So like our first kind of baby steps, right? Into the realm and the land of rhetoric is going to be through the rhetorical précis. All right. So let's take a look here. I'm going to start with the assignment because I want you all to read this article here, The Social Construction of Difference, on your own at your leisure, right? This is, let me see. This is due October 5th. So I believe that y'all, I think that's actually Sunday. Okay. I'm not, this is not going to be scored, but you do want to complete this because what'll end up happening is for a lot of these little exercises that we'll do, they'll end up translating into extra credit points at the end of the semester. I'm only looking for those folks who did it. If you did it, boom, you're going to get points, right? Whether you did it correctly or incorrectly. I'm going to provide you some comments, some commentary, and some feedback. So that way, I can help to guide you, right? But as long as you do it, you'll get the points. Okay. So you want to make sure to get all these smaller assignments here done because these smaller assignments here work to prepare you. They're smaller baby steps, right? To help to get you to develop the skills that you'll need to capitalize on and to build upon one another in such a way that they'll come together for the essay. I do not believe in wasting y'all's time. And even more importantly, I believe in the I guess they would actually technically call it like in physics, like the fundamental law of the conservation of mass, right? So I don't want to waste any energy or any work that you all might do by just having throwaway assignments. No, 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 no. Every single assignment in here is actually designed specifically and intentionally to build your skills at writing, but just in a smaller context until you get to the next stage or the next step, which will expand the context and capitalize on what it is that you started out learning to bring with you into the next level, right? Into the next context. Okay. So we'll start here. The rhetorical précis sentence starters. Again, précis is just a French word for summary, right? These instructions are asking you to compose a rhetorical précis of the previous article written by Alan Johnson entitled The Social Construction of Difference, right? Here I want you to consider, right? So you don't have to answer these questions right here. You will answer these questions all down here at the bottom, but I'm just kind of pitching this and setting up the large scale idea for all of you. Okay, so when we're writing this rhetorical précis, right, we're working through, we're thinking about how does the author work to persuade his readers of his message, right? Going back to rhetoric, folks, right? See, I haven't even really mentioned or like provided you all in week 4 with a breakdown or like a dynamic entry into rhetoric. I just want you all, I don't want to freak y'all out, right? Because it's a discipline from 3,000 years ago. It is literally ancient Greek. I don't want to freak y'all out. Okay. I got freaked out. All right. I don't want to share that experience with y'all. Or at least I want to try to mitigate it as much as possible. Okay. So I'm being very thoughtful in terms of how I introduce y'all to this 3,000-year-old discipline. Right. But if you notice, right here by this time, this is like the second post in week 4. Here, I'm barely mentioning rhetoric, right? This is just kind of the title of the assignment, right? But I'm getting you all to think about the very ideas, and this assignment here is designed to get you to think about the very ideas that lie behind that definition of rhetoric that I gave y'all, right? A way of observing in any given speech or writing situation how an audience is persuaded. So I'm asking y'all to think about, right? First of all, how does the author work to persuade his readers of his message? Right? That's 1. 2, what is his message? 3, how does he get it across to his audience? I'm not asking that generically. I'm asking that very, very, very specifically. And you'll see what I mean down at the bottom. Okay. Watch this, folks. So, how does he get it across to his audience? What is his purpose? Who is his audience? Right? Use the following framework, right? So, we have our framing questions, right? That's what I want y'all to think about, right? As you're moving through this assignment. Okay. And then I want to actually get y'all to think about how to use the following framework below, right, to fill in the appropriate word choice that helps you to create this particular critical summary. Okay. Remember, the goal here is to try out and to learn how to use the rhetorical patterns to write effectively, right? Or rather, how others use it. Right? Do not just quite simply fill in the blanks without understanding the rationale behind it. I'm very, very, very big on having you all and communicating the idea that lies behind concepts or words, right? Not just for remembering empty vocabulary, right? If you understand the idea that lies behind it, right, you may or may not kind of get the word accurate, right? But you'll know the idea and you'll know how to apply it, right? I think that actually goes a lot further. You'll eventually kind of develop the vocabulary, right? That's a matter of time and repetition and memory, okay? By the time like, the midterm or, like the final exam comes around, you'll have at least an application knowledge, right? And applicable knowledge, what Rizzo calls wisdom, right? You'll have the wisdom to understand, right, the idea behind it. Okay, so let's take a look. The rhetorical précis is actually a 4-part sentence structure that gives each and every one of you all a way. I don't care what it is. This is, if you want to summarize the text from Alan Johnson, right? Use this 4-part sentence structure to summarize it, right? And you'll be able to communicate in a very clear, concise, and effective way to anybody who reads this, right? You could even have your mama read this, right? Who's not in my class, excuse me, or somebody, excuse me. You could have somebody who's never attended college at all, right? Read your rhetorical précis, and they will still be able to get it even without having ever attended a day in college, right? This is not something that's like a kind of insider knowledge kind of thing, right? This is something that's meant to provide you with a model for how to communicate or talk about other people's ideas, which is precisely the goal and the point of our unit right now. We're developing the skills, using the skills of rhetoric to understand how other people persuade their audience. Okay. So, first and foremost, our first sentence in this four-part sentence structure or a four-part sentence summary, right, is what is answers the question, what, right? So, as in, what is the author's message, right? First of all, who is the author, right? So, the way that you want to begin, I want y'all to do this with me right now, right here. Let's all kind of get into this exercise, right? So, let's just say, okay, all right, Alan Johnson, okay, in so let's go down here to A. All right. So here, right, we see the author in the parentheses, right? So we got to plug in the author's name right here, right? Let's look at A. So I'm going to trace this all the way down here, right? What kind or type of text is Alan Johnson's The Social Construction of Difference, right? Is it an article? Is it a book review? Is it an essay? Is it a column? Is it an editorial? I'm not sure, but you know what? Boom. Let's open it up. There we go. Let's take a look here. Notice, right? 3, social construction of difference. This isn't quite an essay. This is actually a chapter that comes out of a larger book. Okay. So let me minimize it. Okay. See, like a number like that, right? It's a chapter out of a book, right? So I'm going to say Alan Johnson, that's the author's name, in the chapter, comma, and then I'm just going to plug in the title of the chapter itself, The Social Construction of Difference, right? See, boom, here, it gives me the word title. Then I want to actually take a look here. It gives me another plug-in, B, right? What does Alan do in this chapter here? So let's take a look at it together, all right? Walk with me. Hopefully y'all can still see me. I think you're good. Book chapter of a book. Yes, Eisel. It is a chapter of a book, right? So we can just, if you say, right, chapter, right, it automatically implies a book, okay? Chapters are only provided in books, okay? So you could just say chapter. Let's see. For the rhetorical press sentence starters, all we need to do is read the passage and fill in the template with what we've learned. More so with what you observe, right? So we're going to actually walk through this together, okay? So let's walk through this together, and then we'll see exactly. Let's build this. Let's build this rhetorical pressy right now, right here and now, okay? So let's take a look. Okay, so the social construction of difference, Alan Johnson, right? So late African-American novelist James Baldwin once offered the provocative idea that there's no such thing as whiteness, for that matter, blackness, or more generally, race, right? Quote, no one is white before he or she comes to America, he wrote. Quote, it took generations and a vast amount of coercion, which is another word for persuasion, right? It took a vast amount of persuasion or coercion, right, before this became a white country. Baldwin isn't denying the reality that skin pigmentation varies from one person to another, but rather what he is saying is that unless you live in a culture that recognizes such differences, such differences as significant, they are socially irrelevant and therefore, in a way, do not exist, right? A Black woman in Africa, he's moving into some examples. A Black woman in Africa, therefore, who has not experienced white racism, does not think of herself as Black or even experience herself as Black, right? Nor do the people around her, right? African, yes. A woman, yes, but not a Black woman, right? So here, right, what we have to understand that Alan Johnson is kind of getting at when he's using this Baldwin example here is he's interrogating what another author is saying, other author being James Baldwin. He's interrogating what he means when he delivers this quote, right? And when he said this quote, it took generations and a vast amount of coercion before this became a white country, right? Particularly, he's investigating this idea or this notion that race does not exist, right? So he starts off by using an example from a well-known author. Those of you who have never heard of James Baldwin, he's certainly worth looking up. He's one of the smartest writers of the 20th century, um, and definitely somebody who is a thinker all the way through today's kind of modern social crises, right? One of the brightest thinkers that we have to help us to see our way through this kind of current modern social crises. When she comes to the United States, however, where privilege is organized according to race, suddenly she becomes Black, not because she identifies as being Black, right? Remember, in the line that came before, she might experience herself as being a woman. She might experience herself, right, and recognize and identify herself, right, as African, just quite simply because that's the country that she comes from, right, or rather the continent she comes from. She comes from a country within Africa, right? However, she does not necessarily identify herself as Black, not until she gets read by other people that way. And this here is one of the main important points that Alan Johnson wants to actually highlight here for us. When it comes to the notion of identity, identity is not solely a matter of how one sees themselves, right? Now, understand, we just left the realm of narrative, right, and critical memoir from our previous essay, right, the previous unit. So we were dealing with truth from the standpoint of how we've experienced truth based on our lives, right? Based on our ups and downs, based on our triumphs and obstacles, based on the lessons that we've discovered having moved through, right, those triumphs and obstacles, right? That's how we arrive at a new truth, right, of ourselves and the world around us. Okay. In this second unit, we're expanding our level of contextual awareness. We're expanding our awareness, not to consider or not to just quite simply stop at the level of, well, my experience is no, 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 no. Now, at this stage of the game, Unit 2, rhetorical analysis, right? After the critical memoir, essay number 1, now where we're expanding our awareness into the realm of how truth and understanding is shaped beyond our own individual experiences, how it's shaped within the national consciousness, or rather on the wide scale social level, right? We're moving into the realm of understanding how truth is shaped on the wide scale social level. That is why I have you reading Alan Johnson's The Social Construction of Difference. One example of a kind of truth that we're going to be interrogating and exploring here, right, which is what Alan Johnson is exploring, is the truth of our own identity, right, in terms of race, class, gender, right, even abilities, right, so on and so forth. There's like a whole litany of identification or identity markers that shape how one sees themselves, right? That Alan Johnson is going to dive into. Okay. So part of the way that Alan Johnson is beginning this interrogation is by interrogating the notion of identity through the lens of race, right? And more particularly, there's a kind of truth that's implied. This is what we would call a sociological truth, meaning that it's a widely commonly held belief, and also to observation that's supported through various scientific experiments and data and information in the field of sociology, right? So then anybody who's kind of going through like a sociology class or even a psychology class right now, right, that this is where you would kind of see some of these observations and these truths kind of circulating, right? Um, that identity is not just quite that identity is, let me say it from the positive, and then I'll kind of break down the negative. I'll break it down from the negative point of view. Identity is a matter of three things, right? Identity is a matter of three things, meaning that identity is actually constructed based on three key crucial ingredients. The first ingredient, one, write this down. One, the first ingredient is based on individual choice or agency, right? That's the first way in which we can understand how identity is constructed, okay? It's a matter of individual choice, okay? Meaning, right, based on my own experience, this is how I identify, right? Okay. Second, identity is also too a matter of what we are born with, right? So rather, our family history, our family lineage, our last name, what it is that gets passed down, right? What it is that we're born with is another matter, is the second matter through which identity is constructed, right? Even genetics, right? Our DNA from our parents, right? Parents and grandparents, so on and so forth. The third important ingredient that goes into considering how identity construction, right, is identity is a matter of how society sees you, right? Identity is a matter of how society sees you, right? Alan Johnson, in this essay, in this chapter, is interrogating the very notion of identity from that third standpoint, from the standpoint of identity is a matter of how society sees you. So I need you to understand that, right? We have to operate and engage with this particular text right here. We have to operate from the standpoint, from the level of awareness and recognition that Alan Johnson is interrogating this notion of identity from the third standpoint, right? That identity is a matter. He's considering identity from the standpoint of how society sees individuals, how they make individuals legible. Okay. This may or may not be Alan Johnson's personal belief. In fact, I'm certain certain that it's way more complicated than this. However, when it comes to this particular chapter, when he's talking about the social construction of difference, he wants us to consider and he wants us to actually understand. He wants us to peel back and go through the layers of what is meant by that third assumption of identity, right? That identity is a matter of how society sees you. So he's going to peel back those layers, right? Section by section, page by page. He's going to peel that back like it's an onion, right? So that way we could get at the most, right? Anybody who's ever peeled onions, right? The closer that you get to the heart of the onion, the more potent, the more pungent it actually becomes, right? Especially if you're dealing with like white onions, right? They're a lot spicier. On the weekends, I'm actually Chef Boyardee. So I know a little bit about cooking. But the more that you peel back onions, right, the stronger and more potent it actually gets, right? That's kind of a little bit of a metaphor of like how we kind of peel back the layers to arrive at truth, right? So Alan Johnson is coming from this standpoint, right? So when he's talking about race, he's not talking about race as a matter of biological truth or a matter of biological reality, but no, rather as a social fiction, right? A story that we tell ourselves about other people in order to place and assign value on them within a society. Okay. So now that we're kind of able to peel through that underlying layer, right, of these last couple sentences, let's dive back in. Okay. So when it comes to the United States, however, where privilege is organized according to race, suddenly she becomes Black because people assign her to a social category that bears that name. And this is the part that I mentioned, right? Talking about how people actually assign value, right? On a wide scale social level, talking about how society sees an individual, right? They treat her differently as a result, right? So Baldwin is telling us that race in all its categories have no significance outside systems of privilege and oppression in which they were created in the first place, right? So, in other words, when it comes to society, one of the ways in which society is organized is based on privilege and oppression. Who gets access and who does not get access, right? Access to what you might be thinking about. I don't mean abstractly, I mean concretely. Who gets access to resources? Resources that they need to live, resources that they need to support their family, resources that they need in order to flourish. Things like housing, healthcare, education, employment, to say the least, safety, right? Or rather, justice, right? Protection of one's property, you see. So, part of what we have to understand here is that Alan Johnson uses um, uh, James Baldwin as his primary or first example to set up this concept of racial difference, right, or social difference. Okay, now we can kind of read right on through. Let me show you how to actually kind of read through this essay very quickly. Okay, so what I used to do is I used to use what's called the two pass method. Okay, and this is actually a technique that I learned about when I was teaching young kids in undergrad, when I was teaching younger kids in high school how to pass the California high school exit exam, right? Okay, so this two pass method involves what we call skimming the text first, right? And then going back to reread it again to read for understanding, right? To read for understanding, right? So your first pass, right? The first time that you read, you want to skim. That's what we call reading for ideas. That's the first pass. First pass. First pass is reading for ideas, right? AKA skimming the text, right? The second pass is called reading for ideas, right? So, excuse me, sorry, reading for understanding, right? So the first pass, reading for ideas, aka skimming. Second pass, reading for understanding, right? So when you're doing this two pass method, here's how you can read through this, right? This is the fastest way to get through this entire text. We're going to read the first sentence and then we're going to read the last sentence, okay, of each one of these paragraphs. And then we're going to pay very close attention for these little like three dots right here. That's what you call a section break, okay? What we really want to do is read the first paragraph and the last paragraph, and then the first and last sentence of every paragraph that comes in between it. So watch this. I'm going to show you. Let's do it together. Okay, watch this. Okay, so Baldwin is telling us, right, that so here we're going to read the last paragraph of this previous section. So Baldwin is telling us that race and all its categories have no significance outside the systems of privilege and oppression in which they were created in the first place. This is what sociologists, right, call the social construction of reality. Okay, right. That's a major. That's a DJ Khaled major key alert. I can't highlight it here on this document, right? Just because of the interface from Canvas. But if you download this and open it up in like Adobe Acrobat or something like that, then it'll allow you to highlight it. I would highlight this sentence right here. This here is the major, one of the major messages of this particular essay, right? This chapter, right? Alan Johnson, right, argues that Alan Johnson argues that that race and all its categories have no significance outside of the system of privilege and oppression in which they were created in the first place, which he refers to as, or which sociologists refer to as, the social construction of reality, right? So like that's like one of the candidates for this author's main message, right? His main argument. Okay. Now let's get on into the skimming part real quick. The same is true. So we're going to read the first paragraph, right? And then I'm going to read the first sentence and then the last sentence of every paragraph thereafter until we get to the next section, right? Which is right here. And then we'll read the last full paragraph. Okay, so watch this. First paragraph, section 2. The same is true with the definition of what is considered normal. While it may come as a surprise to many who think of themselves as non-disabled, disability and non-disability are socially constructed. This doesn't mean that the difference between having or not having full use of your legs is somehow made up without any objective reality. It does mean, however, that how people notice and label and think about such differences, and therefore, right? Look at this. Look at this. Look at what I got on my face, right? I'll take a look, right? See these? If I take these off, oh my goodness. Oh no. Okay. All right. Yep. I haven't looked at this small writing in a long time. If I take these off, the reading, the writing that's a part of this reading looks a lot smaller, and it does not, it looks different, right? I can't really see it. When I put them on, now it changes my vision, right? It distorts my vision in such a way that now I can actually see, right? In this case, in this particular case of situation, I could see more clearly, right? I could see the smaller words more clearly, right? They're magnified, okay, right? But if I take them off, my vision is slightly changed. It shifted. Think about the ways in which people in society think about others, right? Think about that through the metaphor of glasses or lenses, right? We every single day take and put on a set of lenses. This is what Alan Johnson is explaining. I'm explaining what Alan Johnson is explaining just in a different way, right? So we take and we put on these lenses that show us how to think, how to feel, and what to believe about other people based on what it is that society, right, has told us how to think, how to feel, and how to believe about them, right? Okay. So when we put these lenses on, that's what Alan Johnson is referring to. He's talking about the ways in which society tells us we should think, feel, and behave towards these other individuals, right, who have abilities outside of our own, right? He's referring to, he's naming, right, that tendency that society has to assign value on those individuals, right, as being, right, let's take a look here. This doesn't mean that the difference between having or not having full use of your legs is somehow made up without any objective reality. However, it does mean that how people notice and label and think about such differences and how they therefore treat, right, the behavior, right, other people as a result depend entirely on ideas contained in a system's culture, right? So the ideas that are contained in a system's culture are what I am referring to, are most clearly represented, right, by this set of lenses, right? If we pick up our society lenses and we begin to view individuals, right, through the ways in which society has constructed these ideas, right, contained in the culture, right? When we look at individuals in the way that society has told us, right, we're picking up those lenses, we're putting them on our face, and that shifts the way that we see those individuals. It shifts us away from viewing their humanity and instead rather viewing them through the lenses of the ideas that society has created, right, for those individuals, right? I hope y'all are with me. Have I lost you? Have I lost you? Let me know. Are y'all still with me? Right? Like, like in other words, okay, cool. Right? Um, okay, cool. Great. Right. So in other words, right, what Alan Johnson is actually getting at here, right? I'm just trying to like sum it up and put like a nice little metaphor on it, right? Is that society has constructed a way for us to view and therefore value how people with different abilities than what is considered to be normal, right? Or people with abilities that lie outside of the range of what's considered to be normal, right? They've given us a set of values that we assign to them, right? They've given us a way to value them, right? They've given us names and language to call out what those values are, right? Um, and each time that we even adopt the language, right? We put on those glasses so easily, right? And begin to view those people based on or through the lens that society has constructed. We put on those glasses so easily that we don't even think about it, right? Some of us are just kind of walking around with them on all day, all the time, right? Especially if we're looking at, ooh, I think I might actually have a better metaphor. Social media. The lens through which individuals, or excuse me, through which the mediums, right, of social media, right, invite folks to represent themselves. Doesn't have to have anything to do with the lived experience or their lived reality directly, but rather they are trying to, right, present a vision, a fiction of themselves, right, something that's not actually in touch with their lived reality, but rather something that is based on what they perceive others will like, right? Right. That mode of identity, right, um, is an example of what we would call a social construction, right? A socially constructed identity, a socially constructed view of identity, right? It's one that's based on not one's individual values, but rather based on what they believe, what they think others might actually like about them. Well, where'd they get the idea that other people like of what other people like from, right? They get the idea from film, television, music, movies, church, school, newspapers, news TV shows, right? So on and so billboards, right? Commercials. I can go on and on. Movie trailers, right? These are all the texts that end up making up society's perception of how we should think, feel, and believe and value about other people who fall outside of the box of normativity, Okay. Are y'all with me? Right. And then people end up on social media platforms, right, constructing a fictionalized version of themselves that falls in alignment with every value that's in that box, right? While their lived experience may actually be something altogether completely different. All right. Right. Um, so I'm kind of playing around with that metaphor right there. I'm playing around with that metaphor right there. Okay, understood identity, truth versus understanding, and the two paths method. Perfect, excellent, thank you. Good, 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 excellent. Right. Okay. Cool. Right. So boom, we're gonna read through. Right. So we read through that first paragraph. Right. And so there are a couple of main ideas that we want to kind of highlight as we're reading through here. Right. So same is true with the definition, right, for what is considered normal. While it may, so look right here, boom, right, what is considered normal? I would highlight this concept, right, or this notion of normal, right? Let's highlight that concept. What do we mean by normal, right? What is considered by normal? Let's see if the author answers that here in this question, here in this paragraph. As a surprise, excuse me, while it may come as a surprise to many who think of themselves um, as non-disabled, right? Disability and non-disability are socially constructed, right? So what this means is, right, and then boom, I would actually highlight this other concept right here called socially constructed. Why? Because it pops up again, right? It popped up earlier. So anything that's repeated, right, I want to highlight, right? This does not mean that the difference between having or not having the full use of one's legs is somehow made up without any objective reality, right? It does mean, however, that how people notice and how people label and think about such differences and how they are and how they treat other people as a result depend entirely on ideas contained within a system's culture. So this part right here connects with the idea that sets up this entire paragraph, right? The ideas contained in a system's culture, right? Ideas contained in a system's culture is the definition of what one could consider to be quote unquote, or what Alan Johnson is getting at in terms of normal, right? Okay. Right. So I would highlight the word normal, and I would underline the concept, right, defined right here, right? Ideas contained in the system's culture, right? So any idea that's contained within a system's culture, right, could be identified as normal or normative, right? It's recognized as that which is normative, okay? So now let's watch this. Let's see how he might elaborate on this idea. Human beings, for example, come in a variety of heights, and many of those considered quote unquote normal are unable to reach high places, such as kitchen shelves, without the assistance of physical aids, chairs, and step stools. Okay, now I'm going to jump down to the next sentence, last sentence, right? Nor are the roughly 100 million people, right, in the United States who cannot see properly, right, without the aid of glasses. Okay, right. So here I might want to actually kind of just fill in this gap. So let me read the second sentence. In spite of their inability to do this, the simple task without special aid, they are not defined as disabled, right? So even though they need, right, these individuals who are considered to be of normal height, right, even though they might need a chair or a step stool, right, to reach something that's in the kitchen or something like that, right, they're not considered to be disabled, even though, right, even though even though they're considered to be of normal height, right, quote unquote, and they can't reach something, they're not considered to be disabled, right? We only consider folks to be disabled or non-disabled, right? Let's take a look here down at this paragraph. Next one, disability and non-disability are constructed through the language used to describe certain kinds of people, right? Let's take a look here. Reducing people to one single dimension of who they are separates and excludes them, marks them as other, right? So the very language that we're using to identify folks in terms of disabled or non-disabled has absolutely nothing to do with their actual ability, but it has everything to do with part of what Alan Johnson is saying. It has everything to do with the label that we ascribe to them, right? When I say we, I don't mean you individually, right? I mean us on a wide scale social level. Are you all making the transformation with me, right? Are we kind of are we together, right? Because Alan Johnson is he's only delivering these points and claims here, right, from the context of the social perspective, right, which is drawn heavily from sociology. Okay, right. So reducing people to a single dimension of who they are, right? Here's his point. Um, of who they are separates and excludes them, marks them as other, as different from normal, right? So when we refer to folks as white, as heterosexual, as male, as non-disabled, right? Um, those are the identification or identity or indicators of normality, right? Again, not because that's what we on an individual basis think that that's what normal is, but rather across film, music, movies, television, commercials, trailers, church, school, right? Billboards, clothing, right? So on and so forth, right? Fashion, rather. That is precisely the message that we see being recirculated and circulated and labeled and made legible as normal, right? So, in other words, that's what society is telling us, right? As is normal, exists as normal, right? You with me? Anybody who falls outside of that framework, right? Who falls outside of that box is therefore perceived, right, as inferior. I just actually heard the other day there was somebody, right, who was giving a speech to a group of military generals, and they had mentioned something to the effect of that they were tired of seeing, military generals like fat and overweight, right? I immediately thought about a cop with a donut. Not that they're the same thing. They're totally not the same. They're not even in the same realm, right? Like military folks, right? Love to salute to all my folks. And I certainly mean that sincerely. I have family members who are actually enlisted, who are currently serving right now. But they defend the nation, right, on a global scale, right? Um, cops, right? They work to, at least in theory, right, if not in practice, preserve or protect individuals access to property, right? They protect and preserve individuals rights to their properties, right? That's kind of the fundamental element, right? The role of policing, right? And so I mean, like, as I kind of heard this, I was just thinking about, like, like a kind of like a big belly cop with a donut, right? And I'm like, man, heck, that's messed up, man. Why you sitting up there talking about them generals like that, man? I don't even know if I can't even see, I couldn't even see them, right? But I'm like, hey, man, that's cold blooded, man. Man, what if those guys were actually in shape? I know they got PT that they gotta actually cross, they gotta actually, facilitate their way right on through. And then I kind of got to thinking, like, damn, why is my man so mad about that? Why is he up? They have to have PT, right? Like I believe, right? Somebody else can, fact check me on this if I'm off or if I'm wrong, right? But I believe if you're in the military, you got to go through PT. You have to go through fitness training. You have to go through fitness tests, and you have to pass those tests, right? Um, and I'm not saying that, right, I'm not saying that aloof, right, or like from a space of naivete. However, there's a very high level of standards that are applied to those upper rank and upper level generals that I feel like is kind of ignored in that statement, or rather the claim, right? That these military generals, right, are like overweight, and that they're fat, right, and that they're out of shape. I feel like there was, similar to what Alan Johnson is highlighting for us right here, a presumption that in order to be a military general, you must fit within these norms, as if they don't already fit the norm that is provided, or rather the standard, right, that is provided and enforced and evaluated based on the military's own evaluative procedures. I feel like there's somehow some other kind of norm that he was referencing outside of the norms that those generals and those folks are already identifying or that they're already being evaluated through. So it just made me think back. Excuse me, this reading, right? This particular sentence right here, right? Just kind of made me think back to that speech, right? That this individual, I forget the individual's name, but that this person here was actually making, and I'm like, huh, that's kind of weird for somebody to say to a group of generals, especially high-ranking ones. I don't think you actually get that rank and like maintain that rank without having gone through some sort of kind of physical training or like at least a fitness test or something or other. And sure, certainly there might actually be some exemptions, possibly around that. But by and large, I'm kind of baffled by the assumption of what that individual was kind of recognizing as, right, this idyllic vision, this idyllic image of what the normative general should look like. And it did not fit the criteria that he was laying out. That is one of the fundamental problems that Alan Johnson is trying to highlight here for us, for folks who do not fit this normative vision, this idyllic vision of what counts as the norm according to society or social views and values, right? Let's continue. There is a world of difference, right? So I would kind of highlight, sorry, let me back up for a second. Back to the sentence. I would highlight this entire sentence right here, right? This last sentence, because that's like one of his main points. That's a key point right there, right? Boom. Highlight that. There's a world of difference between using a wheelchair and being treated as a normal human being, right? Who happens to use a wheelchair, right? To get around, right? And using a wheelchair and being treated as invisible, being treated as inferior, being treated as unintelligent, being treated as asexual, meaning, right, that you're not somehow not only attractive, but that you, right, not you individually, right, but the person, right, has no sexual drive or feeling, or that they shouldn't have access to sexual desire, right? That's what is meant by asexual, right? That you should be treated, right, as frightening, that you should be treated as passive, as dependent, right, and nothing more than your disability, right? That's yet another, that's an important point right here, right? So what is he saying? Now I'm curious, right? Where's Alan going with this, right? So there's a world of a difference between using a wheelchair and being treated as a normal human being versus being treated as someone who is inferior, right? Let's see. Let's go down to the last sentence of this paragraph, right? Remember, we're just skimming. And that difference is not a matter of the disability itself, but of how it is constructed in society. Ooh, now he's cooking. Okay, wait a minute. I'm with you. And how we then make use of that construction in our minds to shape how we think about ourselves and other people and how we treat them as a result. Boom. Wow. Okay. That's an important point right here, right? That's an important point, right? I might mark a check right next to this particular point, right? This last sentence right here, because he's dropping bombs. He's dropping bombs, right? What makes socially constructed reality so powerful is that we rarely, if ever, experience it as just that. We rarely, right, if ever, experience it as something that's socially constructed, right? But rather, let's see. Again, heck, we're just skimming. Here, heck, you know what? So I'm going to actually continue on, like to read the second sentence right here. I know this doesn't follow the format that I laid out, but you know what? It looks like he's still continuing on this idea because it begs a question. We think the way our culture defines something like race or gender is simply the way things are. Oh my gosh. Alan Johnson is cooking. He's cooking. He's cooking, folks, right? We think the way our culture defines something like race or gender or even ability, right, or disability, so on and so forth, right? We think about it, right? We what he's saying here is that we don't even think about it. We don't even consider how society's labels for how we've adopted, right, and digested, right, consumed society's labels for others who exist outside of the socially perceived norm. Right? We don't even think about how those labels don't actually come from us. In other words, right, we don't ask ourselves the question, right? Well, we don't ask ourselves the question, right? When we see, for example, right, I heard one of my students actually say this too, because we had to have like a whole little conversation on this in class one time. All right, one of my students actually said, I think somebody was using an example about um, how they had to, kind of like, do like a makeshift kind of book, right? They were printing out the readings because the book was too expensive, right? It was cheaper to actually print it out. All right. So they printed out the book, right? And then they would like kind of make copies. They would punch holes in it, right? And then put it in like a notebook right there, print out chapters, and they punch holes in it and then put it in a notebook, print out another chapter, punch holes in it, put it in their through in a notebook, right? And somebody, one of my other students, right, who looked at that, right, they said, "Dang, man, that's ghetto," right? And I'm sure all of us, including myself, I'm throwing myself in this whole category right here, right? Um, right, I'm sure all of us has at least heard a reference like that, right? If we have not indeed used a reference like that ourselves, right? Whenever we see something, right, where somebody may actually have, this is back in the 1900s, right, when we had TVs with tubes in them and antennas, right, and like one of the antennas, like little rabbit ears in the back, right, had like some aluminum foil kind of wrapped around, right, one of those antennas. In order to kind of like bring the signal in a little bit more closer, right? Somebody would actually look at that, right? And we ourselves may have even kind of looked at that and said, man, dang, heck, you know what? Hey, that's ghetto, right? Without even stopping to ask ourselves, right? And we might have even just been saying it like, in jest, right? Just like in just as a kind of innocent, from a space of innocence, right? Where and by innocence, I just quite simply mean, right, a space of like not knowing this, right? Or in other words, right, ignorance, right? Like not knowing this, like in the literal definition of the word, right? Right, we might have just been, kind of like in an offhand, like, man, heck, man, shoot, man, yo, hey, man, that's ghetto, man, that's ghetto in the mud, man, man, shoot, man, you sit up there, man, rabbit ears on the TV, you got aluminum foil on it, right, so that way you can bring your signal in a little bit better, right? Like these back in the days in the 1900s, y'all might not even know about what that is, but or like if you had to like kind of take some pliers, like kind of turn the channel, man, I'm talking this is way back in the old school. If I got some folks back here, right, who was born in the 1900s, y'all understand what I'm saying. Right, but we would recognize that, right, as being ghetto, right? Or we might have even like said, yo, dang, man, hey, man, you ghetto if you have these things, right? Or if you grew up with these things, right? And though it may be coming from a space of innocence, right, and even ignorance, right, a not knowing this, right, or not even like carefully considering, what that might actually mean, right? We never stop to ask ourselves, well, who told us what that word ghetto actually means? Who labeled that right there as ghetto? In other contexts, I've actually heard the word ghetto being utilized, especially throughout news media, right, in the 1900s. Right, ghetto was actually kind of meant as a pejorative geographical marker or location of where not only folks in poverty live, but specifically those folks who are impoverished and who are Black live. At another historical point, at a different historical point in time, right? The ghetto was specifically a place, a geographical location in which folks throughout Europe who identified as Jewish were actually hurdled by the Nazis into a small urban enclave, right? And we never really stopped to kind of carefully consider or ask ourselves, well, who told us that ghetto meant instead of like a geographical location where Jews actually are hurtled into small enclaves, right, by Nazis, who told us that the meaning actually shifted? Where did we even get the idea that the meaning no longer meant that, but rather that it now means this place where poor Black people actually live and the things that poor Black people actually do? We never stop to consider that, right? This is what Alan Johnson is trying to get us to see right here, right? When he makes this point, we think the way our culture defines something like race or gender is simply just quite simply the way things are, right? And we don't even think about it. We just quite simply use the language, but we never stop to consider who told us that? Where did that come from? Why does this thing mean that? When did that meaning come into play? Right? We don't stop to consider that. So he gives us two examples, right? Or rather, two cases to consider, right? I'm going to fast forward to the last sentence in this paragraph here, right? So in both cases, racial classification has had little to do with the objective characteristics and everything to do with preserving white power and wealth. Ooh, I'm going to have to go back and actually read this paragraph right here, because it seemed like he's making a pretty strong point right here, and I want to know more about it, okay? All right, so let me finish with my skimming. This fact has also been true of the use of race to tag various ethnic groups. When the Chinese were imported as cheap labor during the 19th century, the California Supreme Court declared them as not white. Mexicans, however, many of whom owned large amounts of land in California and did business with whites, were considered to be white. What he's not saying here, right? I will also to add this as a contextual piece, right? That Mexicans also share heritage, especially at the time that in this 19th century, right? They shared heritage with Spanish Europeans, meaning that's Spanish from Latin America. Spanish are white, right? Mexicans are a composition of at least three different ethnic groups, right? Spanish, European, white, right? Indigenous folks, right? Brown. And to some degree or another, right? African. Interesting side note. Next week, I will actually be going on an HBCU tour, and I've gone on this tour since 2016. Jesus, that's almost 10 years. Goodness gracious. Every single year in the fall, I always go on this HBCU tour, and we always take a trip through various museums and things of that sort, right? So we go throughout the East Coast, especially the Southeast, right? Washington, D.C., Delaware, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, right? So on and so forth, even Georgia and Alabama. And so in these museums, I have the very unique opportunity to go through and read about historical facts about the slave trade. Anybody know? Let me know in the comments of the chat here. Anybody know that Mexico, really not even just Mexico, but really Central America had a little more than twice the estimated amount of enslaved Africans that were shipped from Africa during the period of enslavement. They were also the first to act. They were before the U.S. They actually abolished slavery before the U.S. Right? But did anybody know that there were almost twice as many Africans who were shipped to Central America, right? So throughout Mexico, right, on down into like the kind of northern tip, the northern portions, right, of South America, right? There were almost twice as many enslaved Africans that were actually shipped into the Central Americas as there were in the North American territories, talking about the US, right? Anybody know that? Right? So when we talk about this concept, right, or this this composition, right, of this identity, right, otherwise known as the Mexica, right, or the Mexican, right, Mexicans, what we're talking about, right? Okay, right. So some do, some don't, right? Is there's oh man, I don't do it in this class, but there was actually a really fascinating when I teach visual rhetoric in my 103, well, I guess now it would actually be considered C10, C1002. In my advanced argument and writing class, when I actually teach that class, I teach a visual rhetoric unit. And in that visual rhetoric, one of the photo essays that I show my students is like a collection of different photo essays that were put together, right, by historians and investigative journalists that explore, right, the hidden, and when I say hidden, just quite simply meaning that it's not popular, right? It's not kind of popularly well known, right? About the hidden history of not only the Underground Railroad, right? The fictionalized network of intersecting and overlapping resources and institutions, both public and private, that got Black folks from enslavement to freedom, right? That got Black folks away from the plantation into the non-slave states of the North American territories, right? There's a series of texts that I actually go over, right, that I use, where it talks about how the Underground Railroad did not only travel from the southern states, right, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, right, Florida, Georgia, right, Virginia, so on and so forth, right, Kentucky, right, how it not only traveled north, right, to Canada, but how it also traveled south across the Texarkana border into northern Mexico, where at the time it was certainly illegal to have enslaved folks, right? Here we're talking about before the Mexican American War. We're talking about what led up to, in fact, right, the Mexican American War. Part of the reason why that war there was actually fought around the 1840s, right, is because Mexico did not recognize slavery anymore. They had already abolished it, right? It was the 1840s or the 1860s. But they had already abolished slavery. And so folks, right, the Tejanos were actually conductors on the Underground Railroad, meaning that they helped to shuttle, right, enslaved Black folks from the plantations in the South into freedom in the northern Mexican territories, right? It's part of the reason why the Battle of the Alamo was actually fought, right? It was over whether or not Texas was going to be a slave or a free state. So the interesting side note here, right? This here is still circulating within the realm of Alan Johnson's The Social Construction of Difference, right? We're just on an interesting historical tangent, right? There are communities of Afro Mexicans in which they still they speak completely Spanish, right? Spanish or their indigenous languages, right? Because there was a mixing, right? These folks, they got to freedom, right? They started families, right? They just integrated and mingled right on into society, right? In different kinds of ways, right? They began to create new cultures, right? New kind of hybrid, new mixes, new blends, new remixes, right? Of the then current, right, and traditional values, practices, beliefs, rituals, and things of that sort, right, practices of both Black folks, right, and also too, right, the established Mexican folks at that time. They begin to create a new culture. But some of the things that they actually kept, that these formerly enslaved Africans ended up actually, some of these formerly enslaved Black folks, right, ended up actually keeping as they went across the border to seek freedom. You got to peep the historical irony right here, right? Right, like Black folks are traveling across the border, right, to seek freedom, right, into Mexico, right? Folks are traveling to Mexico for freedom, not the other way around. Right? We got to peep the irony in there, right? And we also got to peep the brotherhood, right? And the relationship, right? The recognition of humanity that Alan Johnson here is talking about, that would even create an impetus for there to be a safe space on the other side of the border in Mexico, right? In the northern Mexican territories, for enslaved Black folks to have a respite, right? A safe place to actually go away from, right, the plantation, right? They begin to actually develop new rituals, traditions, and values and beliefs, right? And some of their old traditions, values, and practices they still kept and retained. Like, for example, in a town where they speak almost only and solely the indigenous language, what they kept were, for church, right, some of the hymns that were actually Negro spirituals, right? So I'll show that, right, in like as some of the photo essays to provide an example to my students of visual rhetoric, right, and visual arguments. That and it tells that story, right, just through the imagery and the interviews that are done with the people who are still very present to this day in that land, right, in the northern some of the northern territories of Mexico, right, just south below the Texarkana border, right, where they still sing those Negro spirituals, right, in English, okay, but not just in like standard English, right? They're singing it in what is otherwise known as African American vernacular English, right? So the interesting thing here that we have to understand, right? I know, right? It's so dope. I don't know if there is a class on that at our school, but it would be so dope. Maybe I can actually talk with some of the folks in our Africana Studies class to see if they have. They might. You know what? I would totally check out the Africana Studies class to see if they. She said, "No, no, my class." You know what? Yeah, no. So totally. If I think I will be teaching, I think that's like English C 1002. And that's next semester. So that'll be the next course in the progression, right? That'll be the next course after English C 1000, right? It's that unit right there. I have a lot of fun with that unit because it's fascinating to me. Yeah, I'm born and raised in LA. So that's just like kind of a way for me to make sense of home for myself, right? So I have a lot of fun with that particular unit in the class, and also too, it's very fun to see just really how getting back to our readings here, right? Getting back to this point, right, that Alan Johnson here is highlighting for us, right, that when the Chinese were imported as sheep laborers during the 19th century, right, California Supreme Court declared them as not white. Mexicans, however, many of whom owned large amounts of land in California and did business with whites, right, were considered white, right? Like, so part of what Alan Johnson is not talking about right here is just that, right? That part that I took us on like a historical tangent on, right? So certainly, right, um, part of the reason why Mexicans were considered, land owning Mexicans in particular, were considered to be white was because of their wealthy land owning class status, right? However, the ones who did not actually own land, right? The ones who were not a part of that elevated class, right? The ones who were, to a certain degree or another, right, more closer in terms of phenotype, right, in terms of just quite simply skin or maybe hair color and or right even the color of their eyes, right, the ones who were closer to being phenotypically European were perceived and read and made legible in society on a wide scale social level, right, through the courts, right, and through court decisions, through the census. They were made legible as being white, not black, right? So this is I'm just providing a little bit of some context right here, right? So this line that Alan Johnson here is talking about, okay, right? Today, as Paul Kivel points out, Mexicans are no longer considered white, and the Chinese are conditionally white at times. Again, here now he's actually referring to like census designations, okay? All right. But I just wanted to walk y'all through just at least this first part right here, right? At least skimming. What I would do now, it will not take as long as I just took right now, right? There were side notes and tangents, right? And side mission, side quests that we had to kind of go on here. And plus, I just talk a lot too. Um, as part of being in a class with Kay. But it won't take you this long to actually get through it. I just wanted to show you all the technique, right, of the first pass. Next, right now, what you would do is you would go back over this entire section here, and you would read through it. But because you already know what it's already generally saying, right? You've highlighted some key ideas, right? You've kind of maybe even like written some notes over here, like in the margins and stuff like that, right? Because you've already kind of at least broken down or at least started to break down the text, right? Now, when you go back to read it a second time, your understanding is going to actually expand, right? So it's not going to be just this foreign object, right? This foreign thing where you're like, oh my gosh, what am I reading here, right? And then you end up getting reader's fatigue, right? You're not going to do that, right? If you do the first pass, if you do the two pass method, right? Doing the two pass method in terms of reading will help you to know what to read for and what to look for, okay? Right? Now, let me add one extra bonus in for you, okay? And then I'm going to wrap this up. We have one extra bonus in here for you. Okay. So your job is to find out, right? Okay, what is he doing here in this essay, right? So read the essay during the two pass method first, and then you come back and you do this assignment. That's why you see it pop up after the reading. Do the reading first, then complete the assignment. What is he doing here in this essay? Is he arguing? Is he suggesting? Is he making claims? Is he questioning or is he explaining, right? Which one of these verbs is he doing the most, right? He could be doing it, and he certainly is doing all of this. Okay, he's doing all of these things here. Okay, I'm looking in the B column right here, right? He's doing all of it. But which one is he doing the most? Is he making an argument? Is he explaining how something works? Right? I'll let you decide. Right? You can look at a key thing, clue, that will help you to determine what he's doing is by looking at the title. The title communicates the central idea of an entire piece. That's the work that titles do. That's why they're so important, folks. I need y'all to understand that. All right. Okay. So let's just say, right, just for the sake, right? So Alan Johnson, in the chapter entitled The Social Construction of Difference, claims that, and I'm just going to pick one of the claims that we actually saw from the essay itself, right? Claims that Alan Johnson, in the article, or excuse me, in the chapter entitled "The Social Construction of Difference," right, claims that systems of privilege and oppression create the social construction of reality. Right? I just took that from right here, from this line right here. Right? And I said, yeah, we need to highlight that one. Right? Okay. All right. So now what we need to do is minimize it. Okay. Boom. So I've just boom, right? That's what this is, right? So after that, right, claims that, right, systems of privilege and oppression make up the social construction of reality. Right? That is his message, right? So in other words, what is his main point, right? The central idea, the thesis statement of his essay, right? I've identified that phrase, right? What I just shared with y'all as the central idea, the thesis of his essay. Why? Because everything kind of springs, every other point that he's making, not only in that introduction, but as you'll see further later down in the essay, every point that he's making about or throughout this entire essay stems back from that point. So that's the main central message, the thesis of his essay, right? So boom, that's in sentence one. I've just identified what his message is, right? Next, I have to identify, right, what supporting details or what kind of details is he using to support that claim. So that means that now I got to go back and read the entire essay, right? Which is why I'm showing you all the two pass method. If you read it doing the two pass method first and take notes as you're reading it, then you'll be able to identify and pull these things out very easily, right? So what counts as supporting details? Oh my gosh, what the heck does that even look like? What is a supporting detail? I'm glad you asked because, ladies and gentlemen, take a look right here. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 from Writing Arguments. This here's from our textbook, which you have for free. You could have purchased this book. That's great. If you did not purchase it, don't worry, don't fret. You have a free copy of the chapters that we are going to be using right here. Using evidence effectively. Oh my goodness. What is this chapter here going to tell us all about? Well, it's going to explain to us, one, the different kinds of evidence. Two, how to make evidence persuasive. And three, how to understand evidence rhetorically. That is to say, how to understand evidence based on how an author is using it to persuade someone, right? That's what it meant by rhetorically, okay? Right, so take a look here. You'll see this reading right here. This here is actually, right, it's going to walk you through some different kinds of evidence, right? So you need to understand, right? What are the kinds of evidence, right? Well, what is meant by evidence? Boom, read this section right here. Right, this section is going to give you all that. Right, then it's going to give you some examples of different kinds of evidence. Oh my gosh, folks, I need y'all. I need somebody to hear me right now. I need somebody to hear me right now. Okay, listen, look. One kind of evidence, data from personal experience. Okay. Here's what I want you to think about, right? This is what I want you to think about. Does Alan Johnson use any data from personal experience in the rest of the chapter that follows, right? Second, data from observation or field research. Again, ask yourself, wait a minute. Does Alan Johnson use any data from observation or field research in the rest of that essay? The social construct of the different, right? Boom. Data from interviews, questionnaires, or surveys. Again, does Alan Johnson use data from interviews, questionnaires, and surveys, right? Data from library or internet research. Does Alan Johnson use testimony, right? Does Alan Johnson use testimony in here? Statistical data. Does Alan Johnson use statistical data? Hypothetical examples, cases, or scenarios. Does Alan Johnson use hypothetical cases, examples, scenarios, right? So on and so forth, right? A reasoned sequence of ideas, meaning like a logical chain of ideas, right? Does he use that, right? Oh my goodness, I don't know. Does he use that? I don't know. I don't know. I gotta go back. I gotta go read the essay, right? So boom, right? Watch this. Look, 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 look. Stay with me. Stay with me. I'm going back to the assignment. Rhetorical pressing. Right? How does Johnson, right, support their ideas? Ladies and gentlemen, that chapter 5, right, gives you an entire list of the various ways that authors use supporting details to support their claims. I need y'all to go through, print that out if you need to, right? Pull it up on a separate screen, pull it up in a separate window. I don't know somehow, but when you're doing that 2-pass method, when you're on your second pass and you're reading for understanding, I need you, as you read through the rest of that essay, to identify parts, right? Take and highlight them, right? Boom, boom, underline them or highlight them, right? Either one, boom. I need you to underline or highlight any examples of those kinds of evidence that you see Alan Johnson using in that essay. I need y'all to do that. You know why? Because your ability to do that, your ability to recognize those examples of evidence, those uses of evidence in his work, right, will help you to answer this question right here. And let me tell y'all, this here is the most important part. This is the most important part of this rhetorical pressing. Okay, right. Develop that skill, folks. Okay. I need y'all to develop that skill. That is the most important, right? It does. Yes. Yep. Yes. Yes. It provides like a checklist for possible, not even possible. It provides a checklist for good supporting details for all of you to look out for across all of your reading. I don't care if it's Alan Johnson's essay. It's gonna give you. It's applicable to Alan Johnson's essay. Let me say it from the positive instead of the negative. He does that, right? What you're asking me, Aizl, right? The question you're asking me, what he does there is applicable to Alan Johnson's essay. It's applicable to Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dime, right? It's applicable to every single piece of writing that we read in this text. I mean, in this class, every single text that we read in this class, right? That's why I wanted to assign it to you all, because it's going to give you the ground level, foundational elements that you will need to identify in other people's writing in order to see how they're persuading other people, right? Okay. So it might actually even make more sense, okay, for you all to read Writing Arguments, chapter 5 first, go through, highlight those different kinds of evidence, right? See what else it's actually saying about how people use that evidence rhetorically, because there's a lot more good reading in that chapter right there that helps to explain and break down how each kind of evidence is persuasive. So you might want to read Writing Arguments, chapter 5 first, right? And then go and read Alan Johnson's The Social Construction of Difference using the 2-pass method on both of those readings right there. Okay. All right. Okay. right? Because your ability to do that will help you to answer these questions right here for the rhetorical pressing, right? So, for example, let me just give you just an example of how this looks, right? Final form, right? Johnson, right? So here it says, right, author's name. I got to plug in his name, right? So Johnson supports his, what's B, right? What did I say before? What did I say? I said claim. All right, let me stick with it. Whatever word I used up here in B, I'm going to stick with that right here in B, right? In the first sentence, I'm going to stick with it in the second sentence. All right, so Johnson supports his claim by C, right? So what is he doing here, right? So this here is interesting. I could use this language that's right here, right? Or I could use the language that's actually in Writing Arguments, chapter 5, right? So Alan Johnson supports his or her claim, right? Supports his claim by, explaining data from testimony, by explaining a logical, a logical series of reasonable ideas, or by explaining, what was one of the other ones, right? Data that comes from observations and texts, right? Whatever the categories, right? I'm drawing from the chapter 5 to identify the categories of the kinds of evidence. I'm drawing from chapter 5 to talk about, as a way for me to talk about what Alan Johnson is doing in his reading. Does that make sense? Are y'all with me? Let me stop and do a check-in with y'all. Are y'all with me on that one? Does that make sense? Right, when it comes to sentence 2? Cool. Okay. Got it. Okay. All right. Good. Excellent. Good. Okay. Perfect. Excellent. Right. So watch this, right? Like, if you can talk about, this is why it's important to read the rest of chapter 5 too, as well, right? That's why I've assigned them in this same week right here again, right? Doing small steps. You can talk about how the use of those specific kinds of evidence is persuasive. If you can talk about it, you don't have to talk about it right here, right? But if you can talk about it like at length, like in your notes or something like that, right? And like think about, okay, well, wait, why is he doing that, right? And then like your answer, right? You could write it out like in your notebook. If you can talk about why the author is using those kinds of evidence and how it works, how it's persuasive, now you're getting prepared. You're moving into the realm and into the space of rhetorical analysis, folks. That is precisely the building blocks that you need, that's necessary for you all to begin to develop. That is the skill that you will need to develop in order to do well in this particular unit right here. That is the skill that I want y'all to practice on everything, right? You got to identify the kinds of evidence that's being used in any given text. Do it for Barbara Ehrenreich, right? Take notes on it. If you identify, right, the kind of evidence that she's using, ask yourself why and how. Right? Why is she using this kind of evidence? How is it persuasive? Right? That's the skill that y'all want to develop right there. Let me tell y'all, folks, if you're able to develop that skill right there, sky's the limit. Sky's the limit. Like Lil Wayne said, 2000s, 2010s, no ceilings. There are no ceilings for you that you will have to respect. You will be able to fly from here to the moon. Let me tell you, intellectually, you will be able to fly from here to the moon and twice beyond a couple supernovas. All right, folks. So now, right here, boom, moving on. All right, sentence 3. Why? The author's purpose overall. What's the author's purpose in actually explaining, right, this text right here, right? So what's the author's purpose? You have to actually kind of critically reflect on that. And that's mostly what you're going to derive after you finish reading the essay and you have some time to kind of like digest it. You can think about what the author's purpose is, right? What does the author want to get at, right? What is the author trying to do for his audience? Are they trying to inform? Are they trying to entertain? Or are they trying to persuade his audience, right? Right. So the author's purpose is to inform, I'm just gonna off the top of my head, right? So just the author's purpose, Alan Johnson's purpose, right, is to inform his audience in order to or so that they can have a better awareness about how about how social difference functions in society, right? About how social difference is constructed, or about how identity is constructed based on how society views others, views and values others, right? So, boom, I'll identify that purpose. Usually by the end of the piece, it comes true, it comes clear, right? Not true, but rather it comes clear. And then lastly, but not leastly, then I want to identify, okay, well, shoot, who in the heck is he writing to? Okay, let me show y'all last trick, right? Last little trick. I need y'all to follow with me right quick. All right, so last little trick right quick. Okay. I'm gonna say this and I'm wrapping this up. I'm wrapping this up. I'm sorry, folks. Sorry to hold y'all on over. I already went over my little time limit that I done gave myself. I appreciate y'all for tapping in with me, staying in with me, hanging in there with me. Okay. So watch this. Let me see. Alan Johnson. Let me see. Okay. The social construction of difference. Right? Boom. Okay. So I need to kind of forget AI. Don't even use that. I need to kind of go through and do a little bit of homework, right? Right quick on Alan Johnson. Who is Alan Johnson? Right? Excerpt from Privilege, Power, and Difference. Alan Johnson. Oh shoot! Heck, look at that. A.G. Johnson, U.S. That seems like it might be interesting. Let me see here. Okay, I'm not sure. Who is this person? Ah, hey, Alan G. Johnson. That's the same author right there. Okay. Let me go to the about. Go to Blackwell Dictionary of Sociology, first thing and the last. Okay. So let me go to the about section here. All right. Oh, look at Alan. Okay. So, let me see what I can learn a little bit about Alan, right? Notice what I'm doing here, folks. I'm doing some research, right? And no, unfortunately, I'm sorry. AI does not count as research. It doesn't. You could use Wikipedia, but Wikipedia certainly only counts as a springboard, not as an actual source itself, at least in academic writing, traditionally speaking. But I don't even need AI. Remember, I skipped right on over AI and I just looked at the website. I said, oh, shoot, wait a minute. Hold up. Alan got his own website. Let me go see what Alan talking about. Alan, where you at right quick? Alan, come here. Let me holler at you. Shoot, now I get to learn a little bit about who Alan is. So I'm going to actually read through here. And here's the question I'm asking. Who is he talking to? Right? Where has he spent the majority of his career as he's writing these books? Right? So here I see a bunch of different, right? So he's got a PhD in sociology, right? Meaning, right here in the bachelor's, right, in sociology and English, right? He's got a PhD in sociology, right? He had a dissertation. He spent some time in the late 70s volunteering at a rape crisis service, right, in Hartford, Connecticut. Okay, right. He consulted with the National Prevention of Rape. So there seems to be a kind of relationship or a kind of interest in domestic violence and helping folks who are survivors of domestic violence, right? And then after leaving, right, the school, he began to work on his second book, Human Arrangements. Okay. Then he joined the faculty at Hartford College, right, for women, where he taught sociology and women's studies, right? During this time, he wrote most of his nonfiction works. Okay, so boom, right? So boom, he's got a lot of books that he's produced at this college here, right? So, okay, well, maybe at the very least, right, one of his primary audiences is a group of college students, right? Given the fact of his professional track record, right? So, at the very least, right, I could say, just based on the bit of research that I did on him, right, I could say, okay, so he writes in, let me see, is he writing in a formal, an informal, sarcastic, humorous, contemptuous tone, right? I think by and large, for the most part, he's not really writing sarcastically. He's not really writing in a very humorous tone, right? I would stick with formal, right? because it seems to be that he's writing for an academic audience, right? Especially given the fact that this comes as a chapter in a textbook from sociology, right? So he's writing in a formal tone for a college audience. Guess what, folks? I'm done with the rhetorical pressing. That's it. That's all you got to do. I'm gonna pause and stop right there. Open up the floor. Open up the floor for any questions, comments, concerns, even emotionally justifiable outbursts. All of which are welcome. Is it shown on screen? Is what's shown on screen? Uh-oh. That I yeah. It, the writing. You mean Alan Johnson's writing, or the rhetorical pressy? Yeah, so you should see the rhetorical pressy assignment right now. Yes. Yeah, so the rhetorical pressy is actually done right here on excuse me, the rhetorical pressy is visible right now to you all. I didn't type in or write my answers, right, or my responses. I just verbalized them to you all. Okay? Right? So I went through and answered each section right here just as a just to kind of model it for you all, right? I'll let you all actually write it out on your own. Okay? Yeah. No, great questions. Great question. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to take away some of y'all's. I have a no biting rule in my face-to-face class. Let's clarify the Pressy is four sentences. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, the Pressy is only four sentences, and it should not be anything more. It is specifically, intentionally, and meticulously designed to be a short summary of another text and how that author persuades their audience. Right? Yes, it is intentionally four sentences. And these four sentences, nonetheless, right? I want you to master, or not master, but rather going back to what I said at the beginning, excuse me, of our YouTube live today, at the beginning of our session today, the writing, I think I was talking about this in the context of reading. Writing, like reading, is really a manifestation of your relationship with it, right? Just like a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, mother, sister, brother, father, right? Son, daughter, right? Whoever, right? It's the degree to which your relationship with those other folks is based on how much time and how much engagement you spend with them. So the more time that you actually spend practicing this technique right here, the rhetorical pressing, right, the better relationship you'll develop, right? Forget about mastering and all of that stuff, folks. I'm not expecting y'all to master this stuff here, and that's not even what I want for y'all. Okay, would it be great? I don't know, maybe. I mean, what would be great is if all of y'all actually became English majors and said, "Yo, hey, I took a class with CAG, and that like that made me want to become an English major." Like that would be great. You know what I'm saying? Selfishly speaking. So no, but seriously, right? What would legitimately be great is to see you all, right? In all seriousness, what would legitimately be great is to see you all demonstrate your own thoughts, ideas, and your own thinking using the techniques that you've gotten introduced to in this course, right? That's legitimately no playing what would be great, right? That's what I want to see from you all. Whether or not you kind of do it 100% right, like I don't want you to move robotically. I don't want you to think robotically. I don't want you to think, well, wait a minute, is this the only way that I could, but I can't seem to get it right. I don't know how. No, no. Do your best. If you have any questions, make an office hours appointment with me, connect with me, show me what you're doing, so that way we can actually work on it together. Again, what your progress is and should be based on right? Um, it should be based on the degree, the relationship, the degree to which you develop a relationship, a close relationship with these techniques. Okay. The more time and engagement that you spend with these techniques, that you spend with these readings, that you spend applying these techniques to the readings, the better and more comfortable, the stronger the bond is going to be between you and those techniques and you and those readings. Okay, folks? Yeah. Other questions, comments, concerns, emotionally justifiable outbursts. Those are still acceptable. Cool. Okay. All right. Okay. In regards to B and C, are we allowed to use multiple terms? Only use one. Only use one. Right. You only want to use one because when you use multiple, right, then that actually serves to confuse your readers, right? As opposed to using one, which clarifies. It has a clear cut definition or a clear cut meaning that you're communicating behind it, right? Hey, I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, I got you. I got you. I wasn't sure if that's what you meant, thumbs up, but I wasn't sure if that was like some new slang or something like that that I really wasn't just kind of hip to. Thank you so much. No, I appreciate you. Yeah, 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 for sure. For sure. Excellent. Yeah. Other questions, comments, concerns, emotionally justifiable outbursts. Was this helpful for y'all? To like kind of go through some of this stuff right here? I hope so. I go through this kind of stuff like more in depth in like my face-to-face classes and stuff like that. So I wanted to give I'm again, like I said, I'm kind of experimenting. I'm like, man, dude, I feel like I get frustrated myself when I don't get to see y'all or like I don't get to spend as much time with y'all, even though y'all are in an online class. I know y'all got lives, y'all got stuff that y'all got to do. I mean, y'all probably taking care of babies, trying to feed them right now. You know what I'm saying? In between listening to my long-winded self, you know what I'm saying? I appreciate y'all for all of that right now. It's dinner time too, or maybe even bedtime for some of y'all. I'm not sure, but man, I appreciate y'all for tapping on in, man. You legitimately got other responsibilities, so I appreciate y'all for coming on in, and I just wanted to make sure that I could create some space for us to, at least kind of dive into some of the material a little bit more, right? So yeah, yeah, okay, cool, cool, excellent, good, 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 yeah, yep, yeah. Yeah, and and like experiment with it. I definitely want to encourage y'all to experiment, to try, right, some of these things, but do the readings first, right, based on the readings and things like that, the techniques that are actually kind of discussed in the readings and that are presented in the reading, right, like try to experiment with those things there first. Again, right, like there's a reason why we went over the Tao of Wu, right, and the reason why we had to kind of sort of learn about the 12 jewels, particularly the first three: knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Knowledge refers to the basic rules of a given system. Wisdom refers to the application of those rules from that system, right? So there's the reason why we went over the RZA and like all those things right there is because it introduces you into some of the very study skills and habits that you'll need to develop in order to succeed in this class, right? So that's what I want y'all to, that's what I'm hoping that y'all actually get out of some of these live sessions and out of the readings, right, is a strong foundation in the rules of this system that we call college composition, right? College or academic reading and writing, right? Understanding the rules, strategies, and techniques of this system. And then, right, making the leap and bound to apply those rules, right? And then to kind of like experiment with some of those rules, right? Like kind of play with some of them, see how what techniques it is that you kind of gravitate more towards, right, and which ones you can kind of develop the best relationship with, right, because that's really where your ideas are going to kind of develop some form and take some shape for the academic context right there, you know yeah. Okay, folks, well, If there are no further questions, thank you so much. I'm so sorry this here is such a long live. I'm going to next week. I'm going to try to actually keep us to 2 hours, and that's about it. But um, if there are no more questions, comments, concerns, or even emotionally justifiable outbursts, then I would certainly implore you all to well, first of all, I would say, will the midterm be in proctorial? I don't even know what that is. I don't even know what proctorial is. I'm so sorry. No, here's your midterm. Your midterm is going to be just like, oh, well, just like the syllabus quiz. It's going to be provided underneath week, I think 7 or 8. And again, you guys can't see all of this stuff here on your end right now, but you'll see it. It's under week 7, right? And it's going to be right here, right? Like, so you'll click and then boom, it's going to be under Canvas. So once I actually publish those modules, then it'll become visible to you. Okay. And then and you should be able to access it, no problem at all. It's the interface is going to be the same way as the syllabus quiz. It'll be a combination of like short answer, multiple choice, true, false, matching, right? Those sort of kind of things. And because you're in an online class, it will be open book and open notes. So that's part of the other reason why I wanted to walk y'all through today, to show y'all like how to kind of do the 2 pass method, and like to show y'all like how to take notes on some of those things, right? Because I want you to start to build up your notebook, right? I want you to start to build up an archive of notes based on the readings that's translated into your words, your understanding, and the way that you all understand and see this information. Okay. Because you can more easily access that, especially when it's time for you all to study for the final or the midterm exam. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah. God bless to Proctoria. I don't even know what that is. I mean, y'all got to put me up on game. Excellent. All right, folks. Well, hey, it was a plum pleasing pleasure. I want you all to take care of yourselves and each other. If y'all see me out and about in these city streets, again, I'm your friendly neighborhood professor, so you might actually see me at the grocery store. Y'all might see me at the movies. I don't know where it is, but if y'all see this visage right here, I may have a hat on, I may not. But if y'all see this visage, go ahead on and say what's up to your friendly neighborhood professor Cag. I'll say what's up back. I won't pretend like I don't know you. All right, y'all folks, enjoy your evening and take care. I will see y'all later next week for our next YouTube series or our next YouTube live. Okay, same bad time. It might be a different bat channel. I had to switch the channels this week because I wasn't available on Tuesday. Take care. All right, folks. Absolutely. Anytime. It is my pleasure. Thank you all so much for showing up and showing out, man. Y'all bring a smile to my face every single day. All right, y'all. Peace.